Existentialism is a 20th century extension of the Enlightenment movement. Where the Enlightenment challenged and doubted God and morality, existentialism denies their very existence. A short and simple explanation. If God and morality do not exist, then man is alone and free, except that this freedom imposes its own constraints. If man is free, then it is wrong to deprive him of that freedom, and this extends to influencing others in their lives and the choices they make. Elements of this philosophy can be seen in many major works of literature in the late 19th and 20th centuries, with writers such as Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir making major contributions to the cause of existentialism, promoted also by the experiences of millions during the Second World War. It exercised a major influence on French cinema of the 1930s and 40s with Le Jour se lève, La Grande Illusion, Les Misérables and Les Enfants du Paradis, and on Hollywood film noir of the 1940s such as The Big Sleep, The Maltese Falcon, Casablanca and The Postman Always Rings Twice. Existentialism continued to exercise a considerable influence on the cinema of the second half of the 20th century and indeed continues to this day. The following thoughts and ideas are merely my own reflections on the influence of this extraordinary philosophical movement which had its roots in the Enlightenment movement of the 18th and 19th centuries. The films mentioned are not intended to be an exhaustive or comprehensive list of existential films, but rather examples of the type of film which could be said to incorporate existential concepts. A number of different types of film with existential elements can be discerned. The first type I will call existential in reverse, because the central character or characters may have wandered into amorality or disillusionment, having lost or never having found faith or principle. But as a result of a series of events, they question their lives and beliefs, and find a purpose or set of values they can adhere to. The usual pattern in film noir, of course, is for a hero to become disillusioned and lose his way in life. Here the hero has already gone through this process, and we see him as he recovers his humanity or discovers values. The hero who has dabbled in dubious moral affairs or who claims to be amoral, working for a fee rather than out of principle, is a figure who lends himself well to the Western genre. This is a genre in which law and order are traditionally difficult to enforce, and where, in the absence of said law and social morality, men did what they had to do. This setting provides an ideal context for action and also some philosophizing on morality, the nature of society, and freedom. Films such as The Magnificent Seven and, of course, the Japanese original Seven Samurai contain a surprising number of passages in which the protagonists reflect upon the value of their lives, even comparing themselves unfavourably to the farmers they have been hired to protect. In the end, they regain some self-respect by making a stand for principle against the very type they might at one time have been accused of being themselves. They've gone from being hired guns to defenders of the poor, and in so doing have found their own salvation. Vaguely similar is the vastly underrated The Professionals, written for the screen and directed by Richard Brooks, though based on the book A Mule for the Marchesa. This is a story of a group of supposedly amoral mercenaries hired to find and return the kidnapped wife of an ageing oil baron. The film manages to combine exciting action and reflections on life, death and fighting for a cause and principle rather than just for reward, and all in a positive and entertaining package. A similar theme was pursued in The Dirty Dozen, in which convicted criminals are given the opportunity to redeem themselves in a suicide mission. Granted, they are seduced by the prospect of freedom, but that payoff in exchange for their services may be considered a fair exchange in a society driven not by principle, but by the need to win, at whatever cost. Here the implication is that morality and decency are all very well in a society where everyone agrees to abide by such standards, but should one side adopt more brutal and determined methods, similar methods may be used to counter them and defeat the enemy. Returning to the Western genre, an excellent study in greed overcoming moral scruples is contained in the underrated High Plains Drifter. Clint Eastwood is the avenging spirit of an honest sheriff brutally murdered by the townspeople because of greed. Having turned their backs on honesty and decency, Eastwood returns to teach them the meaning of depending on sheer force and brutality rather than law and order. Using their own methods against them, he builds their dependence upon him before leaving them to fend for themselves and ultimately returning to wreak his brutal revenge on those who murdered him. He treats others as they would treat him, and thus calls into doubt the townspeople's moral fibre. Eastwood returned to this theme a few years later with the more polished but ultimately less interesting Pale Rider. On a similar theme of revenge and retribution is Point Blank, in which Lee Marvin plays Walker, a wronged thief who seeks revenge on those who wronged him. Mercilessly, Walker seeks out and punishes all those he holds responsible for the loss of his money, applying the same standard of morality in his task as they used when they deprived him of his loot and possibly his life. Another film in which the hero questions his principles when faced with a dilemma is Bogart's penultimate film, The Left Hand of God. This is an interesting, if somewhat stodgy, look at the influence of the individual on the community, and indeed that of the community on the individual. Here the interest is in the fact that Bogart plays a sort of vaguely unprincipled mercenary in league with a Chinese warlord. He escapes and adopts the identity of a priest primarily in order to avoid capture, but this results in mutual benefit for himself and the community he serves. There is, of course, the added dimension of God, perhaps working in mysterious ways. The film even contains a fairly lengthy and vaguely philosophical conversation between Bogart and the warlord towards the end of the film. Bogart appears to have had quite a penchant for playing a lowlife who rises to the occasion, given the right company and circumstances. Once again, he famously rose to the occasion in The African Queen, playing Charlie Allnut, who displays great heroism as a result of love and the discovery of purpose and principle. And once again, there may be some suggestion of divine influence, as his love is none other than a missionary. Director John Huston virtually remade the film just a few years later as Heaven Knows Mr. Allison with Robert Mitchum. More recently, we had Three Kings, in which a group of war-weary but opportunist GIs attempt to steal a fortune in previously stolen gold. In the end, they cannot turn their backs on the needy and actually do good through their misadventures. While the hero who rediscovers faith and principle may be relatively uplifting and popular, a truer and perhaps more faithful interpretation of existentialism may be found in those films which dare to question morality and the structure of society. An ideal context for this focus is the war film. The Sandpebbles is an excellent and thought-provoking film concerned not just with the horrors of war, but with politics, patriotism and nationalism, all played out against a background of the Chinese Rebellion around 1926 and told through the lives of a group of American sailors used to protect American interests in China at that time. The most successful and reflective war films are those which recount epic events through the lives of individuals touched by these events. Such films will tend to focus on disintegration and may offer no solution, but the questions they pose remain nonetheless valid and indeed essential. Other notable films in this genre include The Bridget Rimigan, with an excellent George Segal as a war-weary but principled GI, forced to lead his men into battle largely to help his commanding officer gain promotion. This in contrast with his friend played by Ben Gazzara, who is willing to take full advantage of the death of the enemy. Interestingly, the German officer left to take responsibility for Nazi defeat is played as equally principled. Two nice guys struggling to maintain faith and belief in the wake of the horrors of war and selfish immorality which surround them. Apocalypse Now is generally regarded as a masterpiece concerned with disintegration both of the individual and of moral codes. A trained killer is dispatched to kill a renegade American officer who has been most effective by ignoring any and all codes of ethics. The irony is that in achieving his mission, Willard has become the very thing he was sent to eliminate and becomes leader of Colonel Kurtz's group or tribe. Director Francis Coppola deals with any number of absurdities, but overall the suggestion appears to be that away from civilization, man is capable of virtually anything, and others will follow him because he creates order by exercising his will. Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron is also worthy of a distinguished mention, as James Coburn struggles to make his superiors see the effect of the horrors of war on his men, rather than their global and dehumanised view of the German army. Other films look at the structure of society and may question the place of the individual in that society, or may simply look into the nature of life, love and responsibility, to name but a few relevant themes. They may involve crime, but the real source of interest is the characters and how they relate within society. French cinema has always been strong in this field. Their films tend to be more character-driven than plot-driven. They are something of an acquired taste, but they are most rewarding if you can get into them. There are many classics of French cinema, but I would draw attention to some of the earlier films of Luc Besson as excellent examples of a cross between French and American cinema, joining action with strong characters and interesting views on the place of the individual in society. Jack Nicholson classics Chinatown and 5 Easy Pieces are well worth viewing as they investigate relationships, responsibility, truth, and to some extent the very structure of society. In Chinatown, Jake Gittes discovers the lengths to which some will go in order to exercise their will, while in 5 Easy Pieces, Bobby Dupuis desperately tries to find meaning and value in his life and finds conflict and pain at every turn. My personal favourite, which covers just about all these elements, is Les Miserables. This timeless classic looks into society, faith, responsibility, duty and immorality. Another strain of existential, bordering on nihilistic movies presents an even bleaker picture of society as two equally corrupt and immoral sides battle it out to gain supremacy. Films such as the Godfather trilogy present a bleak, but perhaps nonetheless realistic view of wheelings and dealings as a Corleone family extends its influence over a number of generations. It is interesting to note that in the final episode the church itself is involved in shady and sordid business affairs. No one is free from the influence of greed and corruption, so that the Corleone involvement appears almost principled by comparison. Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal present yet another modern take on existentialism, as Hannibal Lecter applies his own rules and he becomes almost heroic as he takes the lives of those who conspire against him and others by fair means or foul. Many other films have presented brutal main characters who use brutal methods against equally brutal opponents. Films such as Get Carter, the John Wick films, and even the Predator films. In these and other films we may disapprove of the characters' actions, but as they face similar or potentially more brutal characters, they may even become admirable. This world in which principle and morality do not exist, and where the upper hand is gained by use of power and determination, represents a particularly dark and bleak outlook on the human condition. One may admire or at least envy the single-minded determination and strength of purpose of the main characters, but when one considers the impact of such conduct on society as a whole, the consequences would be disastrous. An interesting example of a purer investigation into existence, the effect we have on one another's lives, and the crucial part played by timing, can be seen in Run, Lola, Run. Here the director takes the same situation and recounts 3 ways in which the situation could develop, dependent on timing and choices made. This fascinating little film really brings home how fragile our destiny is, and how a moment's hesitation or another choice of action can lead to different encounters and outcomes in our lives. The film doesn't set out to develop character or plot to any great degree, though urgency is essential to plot development. It is an investigation into the way our lives are interwoven, and how we can all influence others' lives simply by virtue of being at a certain place at a certain time. I hope you have found my thoughts of some interest and perhaps even of some value. Information on all the films mentioned can be obtained by consulting imdb.com. And more of my own thoughts on many of these films are available at stuartfernie.org. My thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you found it of some value.